The rain in Portland doesn't just fall, it dissects. It finds every crack in the pavement and every hole in a roof, turning the city into a gray, shimmering smear of disappointment. I stood in the doorway of a small, aging storefront, the scent of damp wool and old coffee clinging to my coat. The brass plate on the door was tarnished, but the lettering, Daniel's Restoration, was still visible beneath the grime. My hand hovered over the glass, my knuckles aching from the damp, when the door swung open. A woman stood there, eyes wide, holding a legal envelope like it was a live grenade. She didn't look like she belonged in the middle of an eviction crisis. She looked like someone who had spent her entire life carefully curating beauty, only to have the world decide it was disposable. She stared at me, the confusion in her expression shifting into a brittle, defensive posture that I recognized immediately as the mask of someone who had run out of places to hide. "I'm Jackson," I said, my voice barely carrying over the rhythm of the downpour. "I saw the filing posted outside. It's incorrect." She didn't ask how I knew. She didn't ask who I was. She just stepped back, the wooden floorboards groaning under her boots, and let the chaos of the outside world spill into her sanctuary. I followed her inside, my eyes instantly cataloging the stacks of antique furniture, the smell of linseed oil, and the terrifying, cold reality of a landlord who thought he could rewrite a contract with a Sharpie and a smirk. Everything about this place suggested a life built on patience, the kind of patience that was currently being shredded by a 30-day notice. I didn't say a word, just set my laptop bag on a workbench that was scarred by decades of honest work. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the static of a problem that had reached its breaking point. Amelia walked to the counter, her movements stiff. "Sterling told me the building had been sold," she said, her voice steady but thin, like a wire stretched to the point of snapping. "He said the new owner wants me out by the end of the month for structural renovations." I opened my bag and pulled out the file I'd been working on, a complete audit of the municipal tax history and the property's LLC structure. "He's lying," I replied, pulling up the digital ledger. "Sterling hasn't sold the building. He's underwater on a secondary mortgage, and he's trying to clear the property so he can relist it as a high-density commercial site without paying the buyout fees." I saw her shoulders drop, just a fraction, as if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had suddenly shifted. She looked at the screen, at the columns of numbers that spelled out her ruin, and for the first time, she truly looked at me. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered, the question hanging in the damp air like smoke. I didn't have a glib answer. I just looked at the way she kept her workspace organized even in the face of disaster, a trait I found more compelling than any professional accolade. "Because the math doesn't work, Amelia," I said, my gaze dropping to her hands, which were steadying themselves against the rough-hewn oak of the table. "And I don't like seeing the math get pushed around by a bully." The next few days were a blur of cold coffee and relentless scrutiny. We worked in the back office, a cramped space smelling of paper and ambition. Amelia was a force, her ability to recall dates and material costs putting my own rigid data processing to shame. I found myself watching her, not for anything shallow, but because of the way she held a pencil, the way she checked the grain of a wood sample before deciding if it was worth saving. She was a woman who saw the potential for redemption in a broken chair. And I found myself wanting to be the one to ensure she didn't become another piece of discarded inventory. One evening, as the rain turned into a rhythmic drumming against the skylight, she slumped back in her chair, the exhaustion finally overcoming the adrenaline. "I've spent 10 years building this, Jackson," she said, looking at the ceiling. "I didn't think I'd be fighting for it at 40. I wanted to reach out, to place a hand on her shoulder and tell her that I'd burn the whole system down before I let her lose this. But I kept my hands folded on the desk, the discipline of my life becoming a cage I chose to sit in. "You won't have to," I replied, my voice hardwired for certainty. I spent that night mapping out a legal trap involving Sterling's shell company filings, an approach that would force his hand in a public forum, and when I looked up at 3 a.m, I saw her asleep in the armchair, a blanket tucked around her. I covered her with my own coat, careful not to wake her, and went back to work, the silence of the shop feeling less like a tomb and more like a foundation. Our quiet routine was shattered when the midpoint arrived like a thunderclap. A process server arrived at noon, not for an eviction, but with an injunction against our continued operation, claiming we were tampering with private financial records. It was a bluff, a blatant, desperate play by Sterling to scare us into submission. Amelia looked at the document, the color draining from her face, and I saw her grip the edge of the workbench so hard, her knuckles turned white. My instinct was to rage, to confront Sterling myself, but I forced myself to slow down. I grabbed my phone, pulled up the chain of custody documentation I'd been keeping for every piece of evidence we'd gathered, and turned to her. "He's rattled, Amelia," I said, my voice low and steady, a tether in her rising panic. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for the cracks, for the doubt, but finding only the resolve I'd cultivated over years of forensic investigation. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice cracking just once. I didn't offer a hug or a speech. I handed her the file with the notarized affidavits. "We walk into that mediation hearing on Friday, and we present this. He's bluffing, but we're holding the deck." I watched her take the file, her hands stopping their tremor as she realized she was no longer a victim. She was a combatant in a war she was equipped to win. The days leading up to the hearing were a masterclass in restraint. We were closer than ever, yet there was a space between us that felt sacred, a boundary I wouldn't dare cross until I knew she was safe. One afternoon, while I was documenting the last of the property tax discrepancies, she brought me a mug of tea, her fingers lingering for a fraction of a second on the edge of the ceramic. "You've done enough," she said softly. "You know that, right?" I looked up, the dim light of the shop catching the resilience in her eyes, a sight that felt like an anchor in a world that was constantly drifting. "The job isn't done until the threat is gone," I replied, returning to the numbers. She didn't press, didn't try to force the emotional talk I wasn't equipped to give. She just smiled, a small, private thing that didn't reach her eyes, but stayed in the room long after she'd walked away. I realized then that my life, which had been a sequence of cold transactions and hollow victories, was suddenly full of variables I couldn't calculate. And for the first time in years, I didn't want to solve for X. I wanted to stay in the mess, to protect the space, and to see what came next. The mediation hearing was held in a sterile, windowless room that felt like the antithesis of her shop. Sterling sat across the table, his suit expensive, but his skin gray with the stress of his collapsing scheme. He tried to speak over us, to frame our investigation as harassment, but I didn't yell. I didn't get angry. I simply laid the documents out in front of the mediator, a man who clearly valued order over ego. I pointed out the mismatch in the tax filings, the lack of a legal permit for the proposed renovations, and the direct links between Sterling's shell company and the property's secret debt. When Sterling tried to interrupt, I turned to him, my voice flat and unimpeachable. "Mr. Sterling, you are currently in breach of the lease agreement and the municipal property code. You have two options. Sign the release granting Amelia a 5-year lease extension at the current rate, or I submit this entire file to the district attorney's office for review of tax fraud." The room went silent. I didn't look at Sterling. I looked at Amelia. She was sitting tall, her shoulders back, watching me with a mixture of surprise and profound, quiet trust. Sterling shifted in his chair, his gaze flickering from me to the pile of documents, and finally he gave a sharp, defeated nod. The ride back to the shop was silent, the rain still falling with that same relentless persistence, but the atmosphere inside the truck felt different. The tension that had been our companion for weeks had evaporated, replaced by a strange, heavy sense of finality. We didn't talk about the deal. We didn't talk about the danger we'd just navigated. We just drove, the steady hum of the tires on the wet pavement creating a barrier against the world outside. When we pulled up in front of Daniel's restoration, I killed the engine, but neither of us moved. The shop windows were dark, but the place felt like home, a feeling that caught me off guard and lodged in my chest. "You did it," she said, looking out at the rain-streaked window. "You really did it." I turned to her, my hand resting on the center console, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her, but far enough that I remained anchored by my own rules. "We did it," I corrected her, my voice low. "I just followed the trail you left." She turned her head, her gaze locking onto mine, and for a long moment there was nothing but the sound of the rain and the realization that the wall I'd spent my life building had been dismantled, not by force, but by the quiet, persistent presence of someone who expected me to be better. We walked into the shop together, the air inside smelling of wax and wood shavings. Amelia walked straight to her workbench, the place where she felt most like herself, and picked up a small, hand-carved box. She turned, walking toward me, her pace deliberate and calm. She stopped right in front of me, the distance between us closed by a mutual, silent decision. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice a soft, shaky exhale. "I don't either," I said, finally letting go of the restraint that had governed every decision I'd made for the last 2 months. I reached out, not to touch her, but to take the box she was offering, and as our fingers brushed, I felt the world outside, the lawyers, the landlords, the debts, the rain, simply cease to matter. I didn't pull her into a kiss. I simply leaned in, resting my forehead against hers, the quiet room around us becoming a sanctuary of stillness. I reached out, placing my hands on her shoulders, not to control, but to anchor, and she leaned into me, her breath hitching in the silence. It wasn't an exploration. It was an arrival. It was the feeling of a long, wandering journey coming to an absolute, irrevocable end. I knew then that no matter how much the world changed, no matter how cold the rain got, I had found the one thing I hadn't realized I was missing. A place to stand, and someone worth standing for. Closing thoughts. Real love isn't about the fireworks or the drama that everyone expects. It's about the quiet, consistent act of showing up when things are falling apart and proving that you are a safe place to land. I learned that integrity is the only foundation you can truly build a life on, because winning the wrong way is just a slower version of losing. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.